Hello everybody. This is lesson 14 of the lecture International Economics. I will discuss slides 1 to 31 of chapter 3, Central Banks and International Financial Markets. In this lesson we will talk about the influence of central banks on financial markets. Let's consider how money is brought into circulation by central banks. There are principally four ways how central banks get their money among the people. First, central banks can buy securities like government bonds on capital markets. Second, central banks can lend money to commercial banks, which lend this money further to their clients. Third, central banks can buy foreign currencies on foreign exchange markets. And fourth, central banks can buy gold or other kind of precious metals. As we will see, the first three types of these transactions decrease domestic interest rates and exchange rates in the short run, and increase domestic prices of goods and services in the long run. Both effects have significant consequences for the interaction of the domestic economy with international financial markets. In the following, we will discuss these different injection channels in detail. The first possibility is buying securities on capital markets. This type of transaction is also called an open market operation. Some central banks, like the Federal Reserve of America, primarily use open market operations. This means they buy government bonds to inject money into the economy. Other central banks, like the European central banks, are not allowed to buy government bonds directly. The European Central Bank does primarily inject money via credits to commercial banks, at least in normal times. Buying bonds means increasing the credit supply. If everything else stays unchanged, this increase in credit supply decreases, of course, the interest rates. This diagram represents the aggregated capital market of a country. On the y-axis, we measure the interest rate, the average representative interest rate of such a country. On the x-axis, we measure the volume of credit demand and credit supply. Credit supply on this capital market has two components: the savings of private households, expressed by capital letter S depending on the interest rate, plus the money supplied by the central bank. We use capital letter M to symbolize this amount of money. Credit demand has also two different components: the investment credit demand and the money credit demand. The investment credit demand is the amount of credits private companies demand for investment purposes, while the money credit demand is the amount of money private agents demand for payment purposes. If now the central bank increases its money supply by this amount, for example, then the interest rate falls to a lower level. And if nothing else happens, it stays there. This is the primary effect of this type of monetary policy. This is how open market operations work. We will discuss the secondary effects of this type of central bank policy afterwards. Let's now come to the second possibility, how central banks inject money. Lending money to commercial banks. This type of transaction is also called main refinancing operation. A main refinancing operation of the European Central Bank is typically a money auction. The auction price is the interest rate banks are offering for a certain amount of money from the central bank. The special type of money auction the European Central Bank prefers is called American interest tender. The following diagram shows how this works. This diagram, we measure the interest rate on the y-axis again and the amount of money the central bank grants and commercial banks demand on the x-axis. The European Central Bank first sets a minimum bid rate in such an auction. Let's assume 3%, for example. Only commercial banks that demand a credit at an interest rate at least as high as this minimum bid rate have the chance to receive finally a credit. The European Central Bank ranks the bids of all banks according to their bid rate. So the bank that offers the highest interest rate for a credit has the first position in this ranking. Then comes the bank with the second highest interest rate bid, and so on. The European Central Bank reserves itself the right to allocate less money to commercial banks than is totally demanded at the minimum bid rate. This is the targeted money allotment. The amount of money the ECB wants to allot to commercial banks is granted according to the position of a bank in this ranking here. The bank that has the highest bid rate reserves its credit first. Then the bank that has the second highest bid rate, and so on, until all the money is allotted to commercial banks. In this example, two banks would receive no allotment. The other banks would have a credit allotment. So this is how commercial banks in the European currency area receive credits, money credits from the European Central Bank. Question is now, what do commercial banks do with this central bank money? Well, they lend it to private households or firms, and doing this, they create additional money, interestingly. This is called deposit money. Deposit money is the money you have on your Giro account, for example. So it is cashless money. How is this possible? Let's have a closer look to this creation of deposit money. If a commercial bank takes, for example, €1 cash from the European Central Bank and offers this euro to private household and firms as a credit on a deposit account, they typically find that only a small fraction of this euro is withdrawn in form of cash. In the European currency area, this fraction is 20%, roughly spoken. The fraction is called the cash ratio. Why is this possible? The basic reason is that we live in a world where a lot of transactions can be paid without cash. In many shops we can pay today with credit cards or e-money. Many bills like salaries, rents, insurance premiums, etc. are paid with cashless bank transfers or checks. The following diagram shows why this offers the possibility to commercial banks to create additional deposit money. Let's assume we have a simplified economy with one firm only, one household only, and one commercial bank. If the commercial bank lends now, let's say, €10 credit to the deposit account of the firm can use this money to pay the household for its labor services via a cashless deposit account transfer from the deposit account of the firm to the deposit account of the household. If the household uses this money now to pay, let's say, consumption goods, the largest part, typically 80% in the Eurozone, will be used to make cashless payments for these goods and services. The remainder, typically 20% in the Eurozone, will be used to make cash payments. And therefore the household will withdraw only €2 from these €10 in terms of cash. Now, finally, the firm has received a total of €10 back and can return the credit received from the commercial bank. This reveals that the commercial bank needs to possess only these €2 in cash to grant a credit equal to €10 to a company. This means that 80% of the credit granted by commercial banks to private companies or households is created by the commercial bank out of thin air, out of nothing. And this is what is called money creation by commercial banks. Hence, deposit money, which is the base for all these cashless transfers, can be used instead of cash. As a consequence, we can describe this relationship with a simple equation. The money withdrawn from banks, from commercial banks, must equal the bank's stock of cash they have received from the central bank. The money withdrawn from banks is equal to the deposit money credits granted by banks times the cash ratio, and this must equal the bank's stock of cash which they have received as a credit from the central bank. Now we use typically these shortcuts M for deposit money credits granted by commercial banks, and B the bank's stock of cash which they have received as a credit from the central bank. If we divide now this equation over the cash ratio, we observe that the maximum amount of deposit money which commercial banks can create is equal to the bank's stock of cash received from the central bank over the cash ratio. And this means that if the cash ratio is smaller than 100%, the deposit money, which can be granted as a credit by commercial banks, will always be larger than the bank's stock of cash received from the central bank. So if the cash ratio is smaller than 100%, deposit money creation by commercial banks is possible. This diagram shows the cash ratios of various types of countries based on data from the International Monetary Fund. The diagram reveals that so-called high-income countries have typically lower cash ratios as low-income countries. Of course, the explanation for this is that low-income countries offer less institutions to make cashless payments. As these empirical observations show, the cash ratio is not stable in reality. It has a long-run trend and it fluctuates on a yearly and of course even more on a daily basis. Therefore, commercial banks typically hold always a certain amount of additional cash as security reserve. We call these reserves excess reserves. Additionally, in most countries, commercial banks are required to hold cash reserves by law. Assuming that this required reserve ratio plus the excess reserve ratio add up to small letter r, we can rewrite the above formula in the following way. Deposit money credits multiplied with the sum of the cash ratio plus the reserve ratio must equal the commercial bank's stock of cash. If you divide now again over the cash ratio plus the reserve ratio, we receive again the maximum amount of deposit money that commercial banks can create with the bank's stock of cash received from the central bank. So this means that the reserves ratio reduces somewhat the capacity of commercial banks to create deposit money. So if, for example, the central bank would increase the required reserve ratio, this would reduce the amount of deposit money that commercial banks can create. We call this expression 1 over the cash ratio and the reserve ratio, the so-called money multiplier. M is also called M1 sometimes, or narrow money, or simply money. So M consists of cash offered by central bank plus the deposit money created by commercial banks. How does central bank lending money to banks affect the credit market? Of course, in the same way as open market directions affect the credit market. It increases credit supply so that interest rates decrease. This is shown by the following diagram. If the central bank increases its cash supply, commercial banks use this additional amount of cash to create additional deposit money and offer this as a credit, such that the interest rate falls to a lower level, and there it stays if nothing else happens. The third possibility to inject money used by central banks is buying foreign currencies on foreign exchange markets. This type of transaction is typically called foreign exchange market operation. Central banks buy foreign currency and pay with domestic currency. Consequently, buying foreign currency increases the quantity of central bank money which circulates in the economy. This diagram represents now the foreign exchange market. On the y-axis we measure the spot exchange rate, and on the x-axis we measure the volume of foreign exchange demand and supply measured in euro. If now the central bank increases its supply of euros and demands dollar, the euro depreciates to a lower level. And again, it will stay there if nothing else happens. So far, the analysis has shown only first-order effects of central bank policy. Open market operations and main refinancing operations both increase the supply of credits and consequently decrease the interest rates. Foreign exchange market operations increase the supply of domestic currency on the exchange market and consequently decrease the exchange rate of the domestic currency. However, the decrease of the interest rate or a depreciation of the domestic currency affects the prices of other markets too. These second-order effects will be discussed in the next lesson. So much for this lesson. In the next lesson we will discuss how central banks influence the exchange rate via the interest parity channel and via the purchasing power parity channel.